let's say like an island just like forms in the middle of the ocean out of nowhere, right? That's like basically a roll up. And it's like, okay, like everyone's thinking about like how to create this island, but then it's like, then you're on this island. Maybe you have your like own native currency for this island, but like if you don't really have like a very strong internal economy, you need to kind of be able to connect to other islands or other countries that people want to connect to, like Ethereum, like the Cosmos ecosystem, like Solana. Right now, that's not possible, really. I built Catalyst kind of as a way to alleviate that trade-off, right? I don't think people need to be making that trade-off anymore. And I think how we achieve that is basically like TLDR, it's like through permissionless pool creations cross-chain, right? It's like when a brand new island springs up, right? Just kind of pops out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It actually already comes with like a bridge, so to speak, right? Or a way in which you can actually have some sort of like intra or inter island, like nation economy, right? And that's effectively what Catalyst is able to facilitate.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of 0x Research. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Hexens, the most hardcore security team in Web3, pioneering in ZK and novel cryptography. Hexens is trusted by tier 1 projects like Polygon, including work on their ZK EVM, Mantle, Risk Zero, Lido, 1inch, Nubank, and more. You'll hear more about them later in the episode, but they will be at booth 832 at Permissionless, which is just 1 week away. Stop by their booth, chat with the team, get to know them, and don't forget to mention 0x Research sent you there when requesting a quote, and that'll come with a free Web2 pen test with the purchase of an audit. We are recording this intro today on September 5th, and we have a great interview lined up with 0x Jim, the founder of Catalyst AMM, a cross-chain liquidity layer for the modular blockchain future. But before we dive into the details with Jim there, I want to give a quick shout out to Permissionless. Again, T-minus 1 week until the world's largest DeFi conference comes together to bringing builders, researchers, investors, and just crypto degens all into one place in the heart of Austin, Texas. Use code 0x30 for a 30% discount, and we will see you next week in Austin, Texas. We are joined today by Effort Capital and Westie to jam on some of the latest market happenings. We have a good hot seat, cool throne session for you today. Sam, I'll throw things over to you to kick us off.
Yeah, it's only Tuesday, actually, when we're recording the intro, so this will come out on Wednesday, but we've already gotten 2 pretty big announcements today. We heard Metamask say they are launching a new feature called Sell, which allows you to get from your crypto portfolio within Metamask to fiat in your bank account very quickly and seamlessly. It's going to be available in the US, UK, and parts of Europe for Ethereum mainnet, and they have plans to launch on L2s in the future. And then this comes just, a week or two after PayPal announced their stablecoin, and notably the MetaMask feature I just mentioned, the Sell feature, is actually going to be eligible to be used with a PayPal account. So I find, those two things kind of synergistic potentially. And then we also heard Visa announce that it will be extending its USDC settlement pilot, but this time it will be using Solana and WorldPay and Nuvei as partners for that pilot, which is super interesting because up until today, it's been on Ethereum with Crypto.com and Circle. So it seems that they see something intriguing on the Solana blockchain for USDC settlements on the back end. Obviously, there's a lot of big advantages with this one. I can only imagine as a business how awful it would be to have so many different bank accounts and all these just different jurisdictions and trying to keep them all straight. And then you've got weekends and then holidays and stuff. So it really does make a lot of sense. But yeah, nonetheless, it's been a pretty busy day, and it's pretty encouraging to see some of these on and off ramps start to get further developed. I wish MetaMask would have called their features something other than Sell, but I guess that's just bear market things.
Yeah, for sure. It's we harped on this a little bit last week, so I don't want to bang on that drum for too long. But all of the USDC catalysts are becoming pretty extreme, right? So we have this Visa on Solana integration, we have the Beam and Visa integration, Shopify, SAP, and of course this Coinbase and Circle deal. The chart has bottomed. The USDC market cap is a great indication of, if nothing else, at least US investor sentiment with crypto, right? Because if US investors want to onboard into crypto, generally going to go through Coinbase using USDC. That chart has been completely down only, but we have a ever-growing list of integrations and major connections that are, in my mind, truly putting a bottom on that chart. It'll be great to see that kind of turn around amongst the other catalysts we have coming up over the next few months. But hopefully we can get a good, strong finish to the year here.
Yeah, I'm overall really bullish on, I think, just payment rails, or overall we've seen over the past couple cycles now that stablecoins are really the killer application for on-chain finance and overall DeFi. And I think this is really going to be the major, all these different businesses and obviously P2P payment solutions. I think are really going to be like the killer application of this next cycle. It might sound boring, like an on-chain Venmo, but I think, or like an on-chain Apple Pay, but I think we've seen that stablecoins have found product market fit much further beyond like what other DeFi applications and NFT platforms have had. And I think this is really, really promising. And like Dan said, I'm maybe not as bullish, but I'm hoping that the USDC market cap bottom is in because I think the market really needs it.
And +1 to the Solana people here, right? The Visa cited strictly coming to Solana because it was fast. That's the thesis: is high throughput blockchains are going to be in demand. And thinking about a payment network that does tens of thousands of transactions per second, you're going to need a fast blockchain. That was the bread and butter thesis for the Solana team out there, and credit to them. It's coming through. We're seeing it in real time.
I'll be honest though, I'm a little bit surprised like that they, I don't know, didn't go with an app chain or a roll up. Like you'd think they'd want more control over the actual stack that they're building on. Like you could see some problems potentially happening, like Solana downtime. Let's say that would happen again in the future. A little bit shocking to me that they wouldn't want a bit more control over the stack, but nonetheless, yeah, that speed is definitely got to be a huge factor because obviously as a roll up, you'd have to wait to post a proof or be contingent upon the other activity occurring on that rollup if they chose an Optimism, Arbitrum, ZK Sync era, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch play out.
Just I could see even like an end state where maybe over time, like the app chain thesis, you're obviously seeing it in like the L2 world. App specific block space feels like the future for mature products to actually reach product market fit, have a large community, need to customize their UX to again optimize the overall experience for the application as they grow. Like you can maybe see Solana does verge into like a app specific block space specifically for payments, and that becomes like the de facto payment app chain. And then maybe Cosmos, L2s, Avalanche subnets, or what have you, like as other mature products start leveraging other tech stacks. Obviously, like the major problem here is like you need native interoperability across these different ecosystems. But maybe like the killer use case for Solana is strictly payments, and then maybe DeFi and other areas actually like branch out to like app specific block space for their own product.
But also for Visa, all they're going to be using Solana for is payments, which I think is a pretty simple use case. Like you definitely don't need your own app specific block space for that specific, just like one function. But you could see them over time, when they become familiar with Solana, maybe either forking it or using the SVM in a roll up in the future when maybe they do want more app specific block space and there's more things that they want to do on chain. But for now, I think just sort of testing the waters and seeing, how Solana works, getting more comfortable. Like we know Visa is very crypto native with stuff that they've released in the past in terms of research. So they've definitely done their due diligence. And I know like this is definitely a first step for them building an ecosystem.
Yeah, I think the Eclipse team is bringing the SVM to a roll on top of Ethereum. So I think that was targeted to launch 2024, or sorry, the end of 2023. So the end of this year in the next few months. Definitely don't know that for certain, but that'll be interesting to see if we do get, if you can get the SVM plus Ethereum security, might be the ultimate place to start building things. But I think we're still need to prove that actually works first. But Effort, maybe we throw it over to you for the next hot seat cool throne.
Yeah. So while Solana is on the cool throne, I think overall on fiat on ramps and off ramps with stable coins, flourishing on the Solana side. Ethereum researchers, I think the overall Ethereum ecosystem is on the hot seat today. Then they're coping over Lido's continued market dominance in the liquid staking category. You're seeing a lot of talk on Twitter from pretty prominent ETH researchers or thought leaders in the Ethereum ecosystem space, talking about why Lido should self-limit, and how other smaller LST providers that have like less than 2% market share are promising to self-limit to not grow beyond 22% market dominance in the event that they grow that large and Lido falls to the wayside, which I don't think that's happening. It's really easy to say when you have 1 to 2% market share that you promise not to grow beyond 20, a 10x multiple of that in the future. You're seeing Ethereum researchers talking about they should potentially enshrine liquid staking to remove like the worries of Lido gaining greater than 33% market share, which they're almost there at this point. I think they're like 32-ish% today. I've seen talks about forking Lido to have a more incentive aligned LST provider that promises not to generate or grow more than 22% market share. The overall argument is that if Lido has more than 33% market dominance, then that hurts Ethereum's credible neutrality. Lido essentially becomes a governance wrapper over Ethereum, which specifically was never meant to have on-chain governance. I think it's really short-sighted. Not only does it harm I think on one side, it potentially harm credible neutrality of Ethereum potentially, but I think in the event that the pendulum swings both ways, if Ethereum as a community decides that Lido is too powerful, decides to enshrine liquid staking into the protocol, or decides to straight up fork Lido and then make something that's more incentive aligned, via the lens of social consensus, that harms the property rights of developers and of users of Ethereum. I think that ultimately the reason why Ethereum is valued so greatly compared to other high throughput layer ones is because of its property rights, because of its linearness, because of this meme of credible neutrality, because in my opinion, it is mostly a meme. Ultimately, at the end of the day, these are humans operating validators. These are humans working on-chain rails. I don't think any protocol can truly be credibly neutral, but I think there's a lot of short-sightedness in the Ethereum community, and they really forget a couple of years ago when liquid staking was first around or first envisioned, we easily could be in a world today where centralized exchanges are majority of the stakers of Ethereum. The reason why centralized exchanges like Coinbase or Kraken or Binance are not the monopoly powers over Ethereum as a proof of stake network is specifically because of Lido. Lido is also implementing a staking router that's going to help diversify stake of liquid staking tokens to smaller validators in the set. And they're also implementing dual governance in the future, where staked ETH holders will actually have veto rights over Lido in the event of a malicious act by Lido governance. So I think there's a lot of things that's showing that Lido is trying to become incentive aligned with Ethereum long term. I think you can argue there's not one other protocol in crypto today that's more aligned with Ethereum than Lido, maybe Uniswap. But I think there's a lot of short-sightedness from the Ethereum community, and I think not realizing that we're going to ultimately have a winner take most or a winner take all scenario in open source world, where network and liquidity effects really drive, I think, brand and overall market dominance in the future. Again, it was kind of it's obvious that this was going to happen. So I'm really rooting for Lido, and I think the cause for concern is overblown.
Yeah, I'm sure we all have a lot of thoughts on this, but for me, I understand the concern around one entity having so much stake, but I think with this specific self-limiting at 22%, I think it loses a lot of nuance of what's really needed. I think first of all, if the only solution you have to this is asking and begging the protocol themselves to self-limit, I think it's a problem with the underlying design and not a problem with that one entity just doing what's in their best interest. So I think if you want to solve this, you got to do it from, mechanism design from a core protocol perspective. Second of all, I think the 22% is kind of arbitrary and limiting just based on the number of ETH. I'm not sure is the best way to go about it. Specifically, I think the reasoning behind that is because if you limit to 22% or under, then it will take at least 4 entities to collude in order to get 66% of the stake. I believe that's the reasoning behind it. But at the same time, when you look at the design of these LST protocols, it's not like it's one entity staking this ETH. There are decentralized solutions, and Lido is obviously working towards those, and not in governance as well, where they have dual token governance, where stETH holders will have the ability to veto anything that LDO holders pass, which is super important, as well as building out their staking router, which allows for more decentralized entities that stake the ETH on the user's behalf, etc. And I think you should look less so at the number of ETH staked by these operators and instead look at the underlying design, because as long as it's aligned with Ethereum, then I think that's good enough for me. And yeah, you said it, Effort, that I don't know if there's any DAO that's more aligned with Ethereum than Lido is. And it's in their best interest not to self-limit, but it's in their interest to have a design that is aligned with the success of Ethereum and its proof of stake model. So that's sort of my overall thoughts on the situation.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there, Westy. I mean, if that kind of like breaks down into three things for me, right? So you have the staking router, which is going to improve the operational side of Lido and working towards a more decentralized outcome. Then you have staked ETH holders getting veto governance rights, thus protecting themselves from the LDO holders and any decisions they make. And then if you have those two things, you're already getting this more mature protocol. And as that progresses, you're probably going to end up in a world where LDO holders are getting less and less control over the core operation of the protocol, not from a voting sense, but for more of just like a ossification sense, right? If you have this very mature protocol that is proven to operate in a way you want it, it's likely not going to change that much over time. So personally, kind of thinking this is going to resolve itself as those things happen. But to your point about like, don't hate the player, hate the game, it probably comes down to some of those design decisions that were made on the Ethereum protocol itself. And, we don't have that delegated proof of stake network that say you see in the Cosmos. And that kind of makes having this enshrined LST system a little bit more challenging, because at the end of the day, people hold ETH and they don't want to run their own validator. That's what we're seeing. And what's your other option? It's like, okay, am I going to use the LST that everybody else is using? And if it blows up, then so be it. There's a huge other wave of problems. Or am I going to go pick this other smaller LST provider that has 0.02% stake of total stake and go, risk that there's a smart contract bug there? Like, that's the decision we're forcing people to make. And I just don't see how we can really expect a different outcome personally.
Jokingly, if you want to see what the future of Ethereum looks like, it's literally the Cosmos ecosystem. It's literally the Cosmos hub. It's delegated proof of stake. Cosmos is
Here we go.
Look, hey, it's the truth, right? Like they did it over like a longer time horizon. They were able to create this credibly neutrality meme that allows Ethereum as an asset to be like this, ultrasound money, great bearer asset that nobody can control. There's no on-chain governance. But look at it. Like, yeah, maybe they started off like that, but in the next couple of years, Lido is going to be the on-chain governance wrapper for Ethereum. There is going to be delegated proof of stake just through like the staking router and through liquid staking tokens as a whole. You see, Eigenlayer is obviously trying to become like this replicated security, interchain security provider for Ethereum. But one cool thing I think that Cosmos is building now, and it's not built, it's built, but it's launching on the Cosmos Hub this month. Currently, a governance proposal is up to implement it. It's called a liquid staking module. What that allows the Cosmos Hub to do is be cognizant of the amount of stake that is being liquid staked. You can actually look at it at like a liquid staking provider level. So you can say, oh, Stride has this much of the stake liquid staked. You can do a lot of interesting things with that. You can not just like self-limit a given provider. If you want to do that, you can also limit how much liquid staking market penetration there can be. So the liquid staking module is going to be launching in later this month, and it's going to impose a limit of 25% of the stake being liquid staked, saying no, if Stride wants to grow to 100% market dominance, it literally can't. The Cosmos Hub prevents once 25% market penetration is hit, it prevents more tokens being liquid staked. It also aligns the validators with the liquid staking providers. So each validator essentially has their own liquid staking token, and Stride and other liquid staking providers kind of create like their own wrapper around these individual validator liquid staking tokens to consolidate liquidity. But what these individual validator liquid staking tokens do, in the event of like a particular validator misbehaves, you can slash like that one validator's, tokens, and pretty much it forces validators to self-bond a percentage of their atom to their validator, so like they have some skin in the game, so that if in the event they do something maliciously, their bonded assets actually get slashed first. So there's a lot of like interesting mechanism design around liquid staking that I think, like, if you go back to the origination of liquid staking, it started in Cosmos. They were the first people to come up with delegation shares of liquid staked assets or of proof of stake assets for validators. And I think they've kind of seen where the end state is, or the end game is, for liquid staking, and they're trying to create mechanisms in place to, I guess, prevent some of the concerns that Ethereum is currently facing.
All right, well, I think that's probably a good place to leave things off for this week, and we will jump over to the interview with 0x Jim, talking all things Catalyst AMM. Thanks a lot, guys. All right, everyone. Today we are joined by 0x Jim, the co-founder of Catalyst, a cross-chain AMM purpose-built for the modular future. So, Jim, thanks so much for coming on today. We're super excited to just jam on the ideas of why you're building Catalyst, and it kind of like peels back the layers of the modular thesis as a whole. But set the scene for us, man. Why do you think, or why do you believe so strongly that the future of blockchain is modular?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on board. Excited to kind of jam about modularity and Catalyst, and why I think Catalyst is super good for kind of the world that we're working towards as a community. Why I think the future is modular. I'll kind of keep it brief because I think I could talk about it for quite some time. But I do think the net of it is just when you look at how the space is moving, and maybe looking at even like analogies from like a distributed systems perspective, or like a database perspective, you can kind of see that we're working towards a world where it's like we need horizontal scalability, in this case of like block space, or whatever you want to kind of define it as, kind of like decentralized compute, trustless compute, et cetera, et cetera. But you need to have some sort of like shared infrastructure in order to like achieve that horizontal scalability. And you need some level of customization as well, right? So it's like, again, the two things are like horizontal scalability and then some sort of customization of that kind of decentralized compute or block space. And so I think the only way in which we can really do that, and again, we can look at analogies again from like a database perspective, is around some level of like shared services, and leveraging those shared services in order to like achieve kind of this this kind of end state that we want, again, that achieves that those two purposes, right, of like being horizontally scalable, right? I think from a database perspective, it used to be like, okay, like you had your computer and then you had some sort of like general like shared infrastructure and like on an on-premises level, and now we have like cloud computing with AWS and GCP and stuff like that, right? It's like pretty similar from a block space perspective, where it's like, okay, you had different blockchains. You might even have app chains, right? But like you need to bootstrap some sort of security mechanism. You need to have some sort of data availability. And now you're like, okay, well, if we just abstract some of that stuff, have execution, actually make it very kind of customizable in that perspective, we can share some of those other things that we still need to have kind of shared security on. And I think that's kind of like the big reason why we need modularity, said in a somewhat succinct manner.
Absolutely. And I'm just curious. So, today we have, I don't know, somewhere on the order of, let's just call it 10, like meaningful or potentially meaningful blockchains. When you look out to this end state, is that, hundreds of blockchains, thousands of blockchains, millions of blockchains? I know that's like kind of a hard question to answer, but just directionally, like how many chains do you see the world evolving to?
Yeah, I do think it comes down to like how you define chains, right? But if we define it as like block space, or that like applications are using applications, in this case like application protocols like Aave, Uniswap, I do think we're going to probably see millions of them. I do think that in the future, every application will basically have its own chain, or I'll call it like a roll up or an execution layer. The same way how like every kind of application basically in kind of the Web 2 world has its own kind of cloud instance, right? It's like as elastic as you need it to be. It doesn't even really make sense. At no point am I saying, oh, like this rinky dink website that I want to throw together, like it doesn't make sense for it to be its own like AWS instance. I'll have it combined with other ones. It's like, no, I just do it, right? Because it's like so trivially like an increment. It's like such a trivial incremental cost to me. And so I feel like it's going to be the same way, right? So it's like every application will probably be its own rollup / modular chain / whatever name you want to call it. And if there's going to be like a plethora of different applications, like I don't think it's ludicrous to say that there's going to be millions of these chains.
Okay, that tees us up pretty nicely too into the question of, all right, so how does Catalyst solve some of the problems that's going to come along with having millions of different rollups or chains, if you will, execution environments?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the big problem that Catalyst is trying to solve is like, what do you do after you kind of have this new chain live, right? And so there's kind of like, well, there's 2 points. Like one is like, I think there's a lot of projects thinking about like how to actually create a new chain or a new rollup, right? You have all these kind of these rolled frameworks, or you have rollups as a service that kind of have like no code deployments with a bunch of infrastructure, like, like a block explorer or what have you, kind of with it. I don't think there are enough projects really thinking about like what happens afterwards. And so I very much see rollups as like a brand new kind of nation, so to speak. It's like like let's say like an island just like forms in the middle of the ocean out of nowhere, right? That's like basically a roll up. And it's like, okay, like everyone's thinking about like how to create this island, but then it's like then you're on this island. Maybe you have your like own native currency for this island, but like if you don't really have a like a very strong internal economy, you need to kind of be able to connect to other islands or other countries that people want to connect to, like Ethereum, like the Cosmos ecosystem, like Solana. Right now, that's not possible, really, so to speak. I think when a lot of people think about like when new chains are launched, the first thing they talk about is like, okay, how do I bridge there, right? Like, how do I actually like access some of these chains? And so the way that Catalyst kind of thinks about it is, and again, the second point I want to bring up was like stemming from my experience at Aave, because when I was at Aave, like I thought a lot about like how do you make like an application specific execution environment, whether it be a rollup or a chain that kind of served the needs of my team. And I think like the glaring thing again was very much like, okay, like in a multi-chain, multi-deployment world in which you're trying to achieve composability, making your own app chain kind of defeats the purpose of that, at least using the existing tooling that we have, right? And so when I kind of left and I had that kind of feeling of like this trade-off that builders needed to make in order to actually decide if they want to make their own application specific execution environment, I built Catalyst kind of as a way to alleviate that trade-off, right? I don't think people need to be making that trade-off anymore. And I think how we achieve that is basically like TLDR, it's like through permissionless pool creations cross-chain, right? It's like when a brand new island springs up, right? Just kind of pops out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It actually already comes with like a bridge, so to speak, right? Or a way in which you can actually have some sort of like intra or inter island, like nation economy, right? And that's effectively what Catalyst is able to facilitate.
Right. Okay. So it's just the idea that in a world of millions of chains, we need a way to kind of connect these things and be able to interact, getting assets or value between chain A and chain B. And so Catalyst is effectively, an AMM that can pool assets across various chains. So let's talk a little bit about the tech stack before we dive into how those swaps actually occur. So there's no base blockchain, and Catalyst is just a series of contract deployments on various chains. So how is there like the coordination and communication between these contract deployments?
Yeah. So I think that's a pretty good like high level overview, right? Like Catalyst, one of the fundamental values of the Catalyst protocol is having these execution environments leverage their own like native assets in order to actually facilitate these cross-chain or cross-roll economies, right? And so it's not beholden to another kind of organization or another project slash infrastructure in order to facilitate that, which we think is kind of parallel and complementary to a lot of the values that we have as a community in crypto, right? Around sovereignty and around not being beholden to other kind of organizations. So effectively, like the Catalyst tech stack is, I'd like to say there's like 3 layers, right? And so the first layer is vaults, which store these assets, right? So you kind of effectively think of it as just smart contracts that hold assets, not too dissimilar to any other application protocol that we're familiar with. The second piece is kind of like this coordinating layer that basically is like a math library that can calculate a value that we use that the protocol uses rather in order to actually coordinate liquidity transfers between these vaults on different chains. And then the last piece is our messaging router. And so this is basically an aggregator of any possible like cross-chain communication mechanism as well as state verification mechanism, right? And we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a second. But how that effectively works is like when you have all those 3 pieces, all of them, all these kind of Catalyst deployments work in a vacuum. So they're not actually aware of what's happening on other blockchains. They're just kind of minding their own business on their home chain, right? But basically what happens is like they're able to receive information through this like messaging router, this cross-chain messaging router. And then they're able to basically enact logic or perform some sort of state transition function after the fact. And that's where like this coordinator mechanism, this math library that creates something that we call the unit of liquidity becomes really important. But again, we can unpack that in a second if you want. But at a high level, that's like effectively how it works. It's like every Catalyst smart contract just minds its own business. But once it receives a message from the messaging router from another Catalyst deployment, it's then able to do things. And it's really the coordinator's role to make sure that like, what's actually being done after receiving the message is accurate.
I want to give a quick shout out to Hexens. As we explore today's blockchain landscape, let's take a moment to recognize them as a premier cybersecurity provider in Web3. Hexens is trusted by tier 1 projects like Polygon, including a security review on their new Polygon ZK EVM, Mantle, Risk Zero, Lido, 1inch, Nubank, and more. Get a deep dive into your technology stack with the most comprehensive analysis and cybersecurity consulting. Hexens not only uses widely known methodologies and flows, but discovers and introduces new ones on a day-to-day basis. With over $55 billion secured, they cover everything from smart contracts to blockchain to Web2 pen tests.
Yeah, there's been nearly $7 billion of total value hacked in crypto's nascent history, so it's safe to say your team has a lot on the line. Don't skimp out, take your security seriously, and reach out to Hexens. Don't forget to mention 0x Research for a free Web2 pen test with your partnership, and reach out to Hexens at hexens.io. Find them in the links in the show notes, or reach out to them at Permissionless. They'll be at booth 832. But without further ado, let's get back to today's episode. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a super helpful kind of high level overview of what Catalyst is and like the problem it's trying to solve. But before we get a little bit deeper into the actual tech stack of things, I'm curious, like, who is your ideal customer in your opinion? Like, who wants to use Catalyst? Because you kind of look at the Cosmos ecosystem and you have IBC, so maybe that's not a great fit. And then you've got some ZK rollups doing shared provers, so there's native interoperability. So I guess ideally, like in the end state of Catalyst, who all do you think wants to plug into that network of liquidity?
Yeah, funny enough, you brought up like a few mechanisms in which like certain blockchain ecosystems are able to achieve like interoperability. That actually is very helpful for Catalyst, right? And it's helpful because I kind of see all these like these mechanisms as like when you look back at like the Catalyst stack, like these are all just different flavors of what we can use as a messaging router, right? And actually, when we use those things, it provides much better user experience for anyone that's actually performing a swap on top of Catalyst. But to answer your question, like our users are chains, new chains, and their rollups, right? Because the value proposition that we're giving to them is effectively, we can give you connectivity to literally any other Catalyst deployment on any other chain. And we actually work, at least right now, very closely with a lot of these chain teams in order to create an economy that makes the most sense, right? A cross-chain economy makes the most sense. And there's a lot more complexity than people think when you want to build a very sustainable cross-chain economy, because there's things like, maybe people don't want to use wrapped assets, or maybe they only want to leverage their canonical bridge. They don't want kind of these third-party AMBs to be participating. They don't want liquidity fragmentation. So there's a little bit of like design that needs to happen up front. And so we work for those chains, and we work with those chains users, right? So like at the end of the day, we still work with individuals / consumers. We have a UI that people can interact with in order to perform cross-chain swaps and liquidity transfers to whatever domain they want, right? Yeah, maybe I'll pause there. I still know we have that like open kind of loop on this like ZK aggregators and IBC and stuff like that.
Yeah, maybe this is actually a good time to jump straight into the solutions that you guys are using for the cross-chain communication. So I think it might be best actually if we set the scene with like what a transaction looks like, and just kind of skip how the swap logic works for now, and we'll hit that after. But just walk us through the life cycle of a transaction, and then we can kind of see where the communication side comes in.
Yeah, definitely. So unpacking a Catalyst swap kind of looks like this. And so let's say there is let's do like a volatile swap, right? And so we're not actually doing like a stable coin to stable coin swap, which other kind of liquidity network bridges do right now. So we want to kind of have a more differentiated use case. So let's say there's ETH on Ethereum and then Matic on Polygon POS, right? And then there's a user that wants to that has ETH and wants to acquire Matic on Polygon, right? And so what would happen is, again, there's these two Catalyst vaults that live on, again, like ETH on Ethereum and then Matic on Polygon. The user would then deposit their ETH on the Ethereum side into the Catalyst vault. And so again, we're on the vaults. Then we move down a level where this math library basically calculates something that we call the unit of liquidity, which is effectively like there's so many ways to kind of describe it, but I think a really good way to think about it is like it's a universal receipt for the amount of liquidity that you want that you just put into the pool that you need to redeem for, right? And so you always get the same amount of liquidity that you put in. And then it actually goes down another level to this cross-chain message router, where then it just routes, based on a number of, preferences that anyone can specify once the vault is created. But basically, it can use any arbitrary kind of cross-chain messaging protocol to actually transfer the unit of liquidity alongside some other metadata like, destination, wallet address or what have you, or slippage tolerance, right? And so that gets, again, transferred. In this case, let's say we're using something like Wormhole, right? And so it's going from Ethereum to Polygon. Once it's delivered onto Polygon, it then goes back into the Catalyst contracts on the Polygon side. It converts that unit of liquidity from, the amount that Catalyst can kind of interpret into something that's actually usable, which is like the number of Matic. And then that Matic actually gets withdrawn from the destination vault into the user's wallet. And so for this from the perspective of the user, they just, sold, quote unquote, ETH and then bought Matic on the Polygon side, similar to how any kind of AMM mechanism works.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm following now. This actually sounds strikingly similar to the idea. I mean, obviously the volatile asset is a huge difference here, but Circle CCTP, where you burn USDC on chain A, get a receipt, and then take that receipt to another chain. But obviously the unit of liquidity here that's what feels like it's the X factor to me. But again, before we dive into that whole mechanism, which I'm super excited to get to, you mentioned a few different communication providers there, like IBC, Wormhole. How do you think about which providers are you connect with? Because there's like, I could imagine a potential security risk there. So how do you think about which providers you connect to? And then like, are those path dependent? Like, let's say you have multiple providers. Would a path from like Ethereum to Solana always use the same provider, or could like anybody opt in to like maybe bid for those, or what does that process look like?
Yeah, so I do think it probably makes the most sense to talk about what the end state looks like, and then we can kind of like work backwards. So the end state is I see Catalyst as like a state verification agnostic application protocol, which is kind of like a lot of words. But basically we're saying that we have like messages that we want to send, and we need some way in order to verify that. And we're actually kind of unopinionated of how that's verified. Um, well, rather, we may have preferences on how it's verified, right? Which we'll get to in a second. But we would want to have kind of the most comprehensive view on all the verifying mechanisms, right? And so said differently, it's like we'll aggregate a lot of stuff in order to actually do the verification, right? And so this is where, you know, having a good knowledge of the cross-chain interoperability space kind of makes sense, because now you're aware of like all the different players and all the different trade-offs that they offer. And so something like a POS based blockchain that's verifying messages, right? Something like an Axelar looks very different from a layer 0, which looks very different from native verification using consensus proofs like succinct or like IBC, right? And so you can, I would say there are preferences that could be kind of expressed, right? From, I think, the Vault creator. I don't think us as like creators of the Catalyst protocol necessarily have, at the end state, will have an opinion on it. We want to kind of defer that to the Vault creators, or maybe we'll have defaults, you know, if that's like a little bit too much choice to give to a Vault creator. But that's effectively how we view it, right? It's like we're an application, we're just going to aggregate a bunch of state verification. That's like infra that we don't care about, right? And so that's kind of like the end state. How that kind of looks like as like click stops in order to achieve that, obviously it's slightly different, right? And so right now, like we're still in this phase of like aggregating all the different kind of cross-chain interoperability mechanisms. And we'll probably at least have defaults, like protocol level defaults that can be customized over time, right? And so for us, like obviously security, or said differently, like mechanism design is really important for us in terms of having a more trust minimized approach, because that ultimately affects security, right? Which is super important for a protocol builder, because one, you know, we want to keep operating, and two, we want to obviously not harm users and have kind of like a fiduciary duty to ensure that. And so our kind of vendor selection process and who we aggregate and who we kind of route messages to kind of fall within those parameters. But again, over time, like we're going to be much more unopinionated, and we're going to have more of this like market-based, almost like an intent optimization infrastructure, right? It's like you put out a message, you have some sort of parameters that in which you want to optimize for. There are people who are bidding. I think you mentioned bidding, like people that are bidding based on different AMBs or different verification mechanisms that solve for that, right? So it's like if someone cares about trust minimization, you're probably going to use like a native verification approach. If someone cares more about speed and cost, you're probably going to do more of like a POS / multi-signature type approach, right? So that's kind of how we see it unfolding.
And then is that selection? You mentioned Vault creators. Is that selection on the Vault creator or the user actually making the transaction?
I think it's too early for us to say. I think there's been a lot of debate around that in the community, right? Where layer 0 like gives a lot of like of that, they kind of defer a lot of that expressivity to application developers, and other interoperability protocols don't think application developers don't really care. They would prefer if the infra developers actually kind of just had like defaults, right? I don't know if you guys were like following that debate, maybe like earlier this year. And so I think for us, like we have a design space on like how we want that to manifest. But you know, it's a trivial kind of decision for us to. It's trivial for us to like pick one or the other. We just have to kind of receive more information over time and make the right call when it needs to happen, which is not right now.
No, that's totally fair. And we were talking to Brian Pellegrino, the CEO and founder of Layer Zero, not too long ago. And yeah, it's like one of the things that we got brought up there. It's like, you know, there's different groups of users that want different things, and like sometimes people just want the default. Like if it's a game with NFTs is always his example. Like you don't need this maximal secure thing. But you mentioned that, you know, it's pretty much impossible to have a conversation around bridging without the words trust assumptions or trust minimization coming up. And me personally, this might be a selfish question, but every time that gets brought up, I love to just get a reminder of what the definition of trust minimized actually is. So can you walk us through like what trust minimized actually means when in terms of a bridging protocol?
Sure. So I have kind of a different take on it. So, well, I don't think anyone listening will probably refute it, but I think it's somewhat different than what other people say. So, trust minimization for me means that there are the least amount of like trust assumptions in some sort of mechanism that any participant within this distributed mechanism needs to take on, right? And so I think how that manifests right now, and I think a very popular definition for trust minimization is something that only relies on the base like trust assumptions of the two participating chains, right? And so when you look at like IBC and they say that IBC's trust minimize, what it means is like we're basically trusting like we're trusting both validator sets of both chains that are communicating. But what really that means is you're trusting the least secure one, right? The one with the lowest kind of stake validating the network. And I think you can actually take that a step further. I think over time we're going to see mechanisms that are even more trust minimized than even trusting the validator sets. And that's actually moving away from things like consensus proofs, right? Like that IBC uses and the Sync uses, and looking more at like execution proofs. And so I think the most trust minimized thing you probably have is like a smart contract rollup on Ethereum, right? Because you're only trusting one honest full node on Ethereum, which is like stupidly easy, right? Because like all the state technically lives on Ethereum, even though it's all being like, you know, all the execution, all the computations being done on like some sort of like rollup environment. So I think that's like the golden standard that we all need to move towards eventually, right? And how that looks in a cross-chain context gets really hazy because it's like, okay, if two rollups are sharing a DA layer, it becomes really easy. If they're sharing a settlement layer, it becomes very easy. If they're not, then what can you do, right? So that's like the open question that a lot of people in the interoperability space kind of think about right now. Is like in this, you're kind of looking at this like very heterogeneous environment of like, you know, different rollups with different virtual machines and settlement layers and DA layers. Like, how do you actually do verification? And it looks really, really messy, and it's hard to scale that. And so again, it's kind of like an open question about how to really address that in the future of bridging.
And then, so in the context of Catalyst, does the ability to have a trust minimized swap between chain A and chain B that's Catalyst is deployed to depend on the overlap between the settlement and the DA, and specifically how the communication protocol that is being leveraged is connecting to both chains?
Yeah, I would say so. At the end of the day, like Catalyst is an application protocol, right? Kind of what I was saying. It's like we're kind of agnostic to all this craziness that's happening underneath the hood. But we're very aware of it, right? I actually spend probably the bulk of my time thinking about some of these infrastructure level implications. The more trust minimized, the better. We work very closely with the Celestia kind of ecosystem, and we do like kind of the minimization of trust assumptions that a builder needs to make in order to leverage a shared DA layer. But with that said, we recognize that this, in this kind of world of millions of rollups / chains, there's just going to be a lot of not fragmentation, but a lot of non-standardization, a lot of heterogeneity. And we actually built Catalyst with that in mind, right? It's like great if there's just like a shared settlement layer and everyone's just using a rollup, and there's like, with a shared sequencer, it's great UX, et cetera, et cetera. But Catalyst, as you can probably glean from going through the tech stack, is built for a lot of different ways, right? And we're probably not going to see that change. At least I don't think so in the near future. And I think we're well positioned to kind of be we're well suited, irrespective of like how this kind of infra level changes occur.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And honestly, kind of like building your protocol from the standpoint of knowing you can't predict the future is probably the right approach to take. So I like that. But switching gears a little bit over to the AMM and swap side of Catalyst, I wanted to talk a little bit about how swaps are actually processed. Can you explain to us the units of liquidity metric that you mentioned a little bit earlier in the conversation? How exactly that's calculated by Catalyst AMM?
Yeah. So we kind of walk through a swap life cycle at a high level, and everyone probably saw that I kind of hand waved this like really important piece of it, right? And so effectively, which is kind of like the crux of exactly how Catalyst even works in the first place. And so again, it's like vaults, people put in money, and then this coordinator creates this unit of liquidity. It's sent through some routers. The unit of liquidity does all this, crazy stuff, and it kind of just works. So the unit of liquidity is not like magic, nor is it like a black box. We actually have our white paper out, and so folks that are interested in kind of the more formal math of it can review it. But effectively, what the unit of liquidity is maybe I'll say what it literally is, and then I'll probably use a few analogies that might be helpful. So it literally is the calculation of of it's basically like it is literally the integral of a price curve, right? And so when you look at like a Uniswap AMM, everyone's pretty familiar with like constant product market makers and X times Y equals K. A Catalyst is an AMM too, so it works the same way. The only difference is that it works within the context of just one asset as opposed to two. And again, I'm still trying to find the right way to articulate this, but effectively, we achieve that by using like integrals, right? It's like, let's take the ETH pool, for example. So it's like someone's depositing ETH into the pool. They're moving along this price curve, right? And you actually generate an integral. This integral effectively says like, okay, this is how much like liquidity that you've kind of put into this vault. So you can kind of think of it as like a proportion, right? It's like, okay, like there's 100 ETH in this pool. I put in 1 ETH. You generate this like area underneath the curve. It's effectively like 10%, or in this case, 1% of the pool, right? You then transmit that as a cross-chain message into the destination chain, and then they say, okay, we're just going to withdraw 1% of this pool, right? That's a super, super simplified, almost like borderline erroneous analogy to use, but I think it's a pretty helpful one. So that's effectively what the unit of liquidity is, right? It's like, it's just coordinating, or it's saying how much liquidity has been deposited on the origin side and ensuring that the same amount of liquidity or the same proportion of liquidity is withdrawn from the destination side, right? So that's like kind of what it looks like formally. I think what's been helpful for people is thinking about it in terms of like USD. And so it's like, okay, like there is $1 million in this pool, right? And I put in another $1,000. I have to the unit liquidity ensures that I always receive $1,000 coming out of it, right? plus or minus some slippage. So that's effectively what the unit of liquidity is.
Okay, so I'm going to attempt to try to unpack this a little bit. So, like, I understand that, you know, when you deposit, let's say ETH on the Ethereum contract, you get this it's not, I don't want to say token because it's not a token, it's just like this accounting metric that holds that piece of value, and like that unit of liquidity is your receipt that gets transmitted to chain B, and then you can withdraw that value. And so, like, does the protocol need to be price aware of, like, you know, the value of one ETH when I deposit, or is it strictly just the raw units within this vault?
It's the latter. And so
Okay.
this is where, like, you know, arbitrageurs and external participants ensure the harmonization of market prices, right? Like any other AMM mechanism.
Okay, so that would mean that, you know, if there is $1 million of ETH on chain on Ethereum, let's say, and let's continue with the Matic example, that there needs to be $1 million of Matic on the Polygon POS chain. Is that right?
Yeah, and like market dynamics will ensure that that's the case.
Okay, now that makes sense to me, right? Because then once you get that, let's say, you know, I deposited 1% of liquidity on chain A, then I can take that unit of account to chain B and get that 1% of liquidity. So that makes sense, because if it wasn't going to be price aware, I just could not wrap my head around how you would get how you would be ensured that that's the case. And so let's talk a bit about that arbitrage opportunity then. So is that just going to exist such the case that arbitrageurs would be able to profitably ensure that's the case? Or, like, walk us through what that MEV opportunity would look like.
Yeah, so there's a number of ways in which there is profits to be extracted. It effectively looks like from the deposit side and from the swap side, right? And so on the deposit side, if you see an imbalanced, you know, imbalanced vaults, like effectively you can like harmonize the balances to ensure that the values are the same, right? There's just like an opportunity to make money from that perspective, right? So you receive like a disproportionate amount of like vault tokens essentially in that kind of arbitrage opportunity. Another opportunity is basically like when you're doing a swap, people, of course, this is well documented, like they express their tolerance for slippage, right? And so when you're communicating the unit of liquidity, you can effectively bundle transactions around it to push this transaction to its slippage tolerance bounds, and you can kind of take that delta, right? And so we're pretty MEV aware. I do spend a lot of my time thinking about MEV as well. And effectively what it comes down to is we're designing a protocol that is MEV aware and is able to actually create mechanisms to have MEV searchers like effectively pay for the right of this privileged position, or you know, pay for the right to access this privileged information, and or in doing so, we actually accumulate you know, fees or revenue for the protocol that can be distributed to wherever we see fit. In this case, the default will be to LPs effectively.
Okay, so that's in the context of AMM design in, you know, 2023. I think that's all anybody talks about is how can you be an AMM and internalize some of the MEV opportunity that's created, ultimately to benefit LP profitability. I think, you know, IL and LVR are these two popular metrics used to measure that, and, you know, being an LP and an AMM today is notoriously negative EV. So this is a super interesting way to kind of offset some of that, and something a lot of dexes have struggled to do and quite honestly failed to do. So I want to get a little more, and like, how do you identify when that opportunity exists and that a searcher is willing to bid for it? Is there like a different swap route you would go through? And further to that, how, like, I would assume there needs to be some sort of auction mechanism here.
Yeah, so the caveat I'll give is that it's not something that we can publicly disclose right now. But there will come a time where we will disclose it, and we do plan on, you know, not having it be proprietary. But effectively how it works comes down to the cross-chain nature of Catalyst. And it comes down to the cross-chain nature of Catalyst. And when you look at kind of the transaction lifecycle of Catalyst, or really any sort of like cross-chain application, you do rely on a set of privileged actors in order to facilitate those transactions, right? And so you can really, not easily, but like it's a straightforward like exercise to basically create a auction type mechanism for those privileged actors, right? Sorry if this is like pretty abstract, but that's like effectively how it's going to look. The way that Catalyst is MEV aware and able to kind of harness some of that that value generation is due to the cross-chain nature of Catalyst, right? It's like when you have an AMM or you have any sort of application that isn't cross-chain and is basically entirely beholden to the kind of dynamic / consensus mechanism of the origin chain / home chain. What we're trying to do to capture MEV is not possible for those applications, right? And so but I think a lot of applications over time will be more cross-chain, and I think we'll greatly benefit from that. And so just wanted to like caveat that this isn't like a silver bullet necessarily for everything.
I'm just wondering how you think about like incentivizing long-term and sustainable LPs, as that'll probably prove rather critical for Catalyst functioning properly.
This is an open research topic for us, and I think just for the broader DeFi community. I would say that one lever that is really, kind of lucrative to pull is on the MEV kind of recapture kind of mechanisms that we discussed. Another piece is around creating like logic around LPing such that fees will either outweigh impermanent loss, or creating instruments that hedge impermanent loss, or creating brand new kind of financial instruments that provide delta neutral positions for LP deposits, right? And so, funny enough, this is actually a series of research that we're about to post in the coming weeks. But I can talk about it because it's just research. So one piece of it is having logic on the protocol that ensures that basically tries to maximize LP fees, right? Within the boundaries of like having still like seamless user experience and not kind of deteriorating from organic volume within a protocol. And so you mentioned like LVR, which I think is a perfectly good kind of research experiment or research metric. There's been like more kind of like more, how do I say this, like real world kind of applications of LVR. Like I think Flare is another one that is really fascinating, and some protocols are trying to implement that metric as well in order to maximize fees. And then around like the creation of certain hedging instruments, leveraging derivatives, or leveraging basically like either like creating derivatives that help LPs, or treating these liquidity positions like derivatives, where you're basically like selling volatility, or you have some sort of like option selling strategy in order to ensure delta neutrality. That also is like, I think, actively being explored in the DeFi industry. And so I think those are some other levers that can be pulled in order to maximize LP returns. I think putting that aside, there is a big discussion that's happening around what does it mean to serve, like what does it mean to help LPs, or what does it mean to create mechanisms or products that maximize LP returns, and like why we need that, right? And so I guess like a bit abstract, but it's around like capital efficiency. It's like, okay, like, do we want LPs for TVL's sake, or like, do they actually serve a certain purpose? How do we like create enough TVL slash LPs or slash liquidity deposited that just achieves the purpose of the protocol, right? Because like liquidity mining and like even having TVL in general, as it came out, like early 2020, was to service a product, right? It's like, okay, we'll always have liquidity for this lending protocol. We'll always have liquidity to do the swap, right? So it's like just getting more and more liquidity, even if it's not actually benefiting the actions that these protocols want to, or the experiences that these protocols want to be creating, kind of defeats the purpose, right? So like there's a bit of like an existential question around that as well. And I think nothing is greater than nothing's a greater example of that than like RFQ systems, right? They're like, let's do away with LPs and just kind of service the core experience that we've wanted to service as an industry, which is just like swapping assets, right? And it's like, okay, well then you have like privileged actors. How do you decentralize it, make them not privileged actors? How do you capture MEV in that example? And I think there's a slew of projects that are kind of thinking about them. I won't name drop them here, but yeah, it's kind of another kind of somewhat orthogonal pursuit, right? But I think relevant in the grand scheme of kind of DeFi mechanism design.
Yeah, right on. I think that makes a ton of sense and the direction you're pushing there. And at the beginning, it sounded like we're getting dynamic fees. So for that, we thank you. But I'm curious are there any like theoretical bounds to what AMM invariance would be possible here? Like, because you need to calculate down to the unit of liquidity rather than like the y-axis asset, for example, like would a Uni V3 type concentrated liquidity defined by the LPs work, or something like a Curve V2 automated concentrated liquidity that's rebalanced by the traders rather than the LPs? Like, is there basically any infinite design space on the AMM curve?
Yes, especially because of the way in which like the price curves are designed. Basically Catalyst is like as customizable, as flexible as the human imagination as it pertains to invariance. Yeah, so it was kind of like a byproduct of creating the protocol, not necessarily like something that I think people are really craving, but I do think it allows for more design space and allows the protocol to be future proof.
That's awesome. Well, that was a great overview of kind of like, how it is, how it works, what needs to happen as far as communication goes. So I got to ask you, where are we today? I know we're live on testnet, but which chains are integrated, and ultimately when are we hitting mainnet?
Yeah, so right now we're on testnet, but we call it our demo. So it was basically showcasing our UI to do swaps in kind of a limited functionality perspective. So the demo is live on Canto, Chronos, and Scroll, which kind of showcased like Cosmos to roll up swaps, which we thought which got a lot of kind of buzz when it came out a few months ago. But we will deprecate that demo because it's a demo at the end of the day, just show something limited. And so we'll have our real testnet coming out next month. And then we plan to be on mainnet by end of the year.
Awesome. Love to hear that. Well, we're coming up close on the year end now that this year's been blowing by, but I'm excited to kind of get my hands dirty and play with something more than just the demo. And as far as integrating new chains, like what needs to happen from a technical perspective, just given that it's a series of contract deployments. So, assuming you already have the code base written for that particular chain's language, is it as simple as just, making an agreement amongst the team, or how does that work to get a new chain deployment?
It is stupidly trivial. So it really comes down to what the business case looks like, right? And again, this is like full training wheels on. So it's somewhat manual in terms of a decision-making process. In the future, especially as we see the scale that we want to see of like hundreds of thousands and then millions of rollups, it will be truly permissionless, right? Permissionless deployments using any sort of rollup framework / RAS framework that these new chain / rollup teams are using. So yeah, so ultimately comes down to the business case for us right now. Not even from like a overhead perspective, because that's quite trivial. It's literally from like a just a focus perspective, a go-to-market focus perspective, right? It's like probably doesn't mean anything if a project comes out and you're on like 50 chains, right? So we'll be on a handful of all of the meaningful ones, I would say. Yeah, actually, yeah. We've seen a lot of proof points that validate Catalyst and its value, as well as where we see the space moving in the past few months with, Base coming out and a bunch of other new chains getting announced or getting launched. I think it's very timely for Catalyst to come out. So I'm excited for that to happen.
Do you think this model could theoretically ever plug into native Bitcoin, or just given Bitcoin's restrictions, never would be possible?
It's an active research area for us, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah, that seems to be one of the pain points of all cross-chain infrastructure, really. I think Thorchain's one of the only ones I can think of that does have native integration with native Bitcoin. Of course, different set of trust assumptions there, but nonetheless, I think that's pretty fascinating. So super excited to see if you guys can get something worked out there.
Yeah, I think that's an active research or active point of exploration for us, because right, it's Bitcoin. Like the liquidity there alone is worth kind of the engineering / research hours that we put into it.
Yeah. And so zooming out a little further back into the more modular space as a whole, you guys somewhat recently announced you're working alongside Celestia to kind of build out the role or interoperability for the role space on that DA layer. What specifically is Catalyst doing to kind of connect to these Celestia chains, and how does that ultimately help the business case for Catalyst as a whole?
Yeah, so Celestia is something that we're really excited about because, one, as I mentioned before, I think the user experience of having a shared DA layer is really great for chains / rollups that are built on top of them. Um, Two, I think they have, or the team has been contributing to a really kind of well thought out solution in Rollkit, as part of kind of the roll up framework conversation. And so all that to be said, like we like working within the Celestia ecosystem and kind of showcasing the power of Catalyst. And so how that effectively looks is using roll kits as kind of like a distribution mechanism for Catalyst, so to speak. So it's like chain builders that are using, they're building their chain / rollups using Rollkit, can have a Catalyst deployment at launch, and then again, it kind of allows for the connectivity to every other Catalyst deployment and every other chain out of the box. So that's like effectively how it looks, like tactically, and then like again, because of the shared DA layer aspect, we can actually have a lot of kind of user experience unlocks in terms of reduced latency of swaps between the chains using Celestia. So really exciting stuff. And again, I very, very bullish on the ecosystem. So I like participating in any way we can.
Yeah, that's a super interesting idea to think about. Is if they really do nail that vision where a builder can just go on and it's like a no code environment where you're just clicking a series of check boxes of how you want to deploy your chain. I could imagine one of those check boxes being deploy with Catalyst and already have the contracts natively on the chain. That could be super exciting. Very interesting future to think about nonetheless. And it kind of like also makes you think about, you guys also have a partnership with Eclipse, I believe, or you're doing some work with them as well. And that kind of same narrative, right? Any of these roll up as a service offerings kind of seem like a natural fit. Is that the case in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we've found a lot of excitement from the teams and ecosystems, I would say, for what we're trying to bring.
That's awesome. Well, Jim, this has been a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed you coming on the show and giving us the ones and twos on Catalyst and the modular thesis as a whole. I'd love to give you the opportunity to tell the audience more about Catalyst and where to find more about it, and yourself as well. I know you're on Twitter.
Yeah, sure. So Catalyst has a very, very ambitious vision. We are a liquidity network. We're an AMM that is connecting every chain, irrespective of anything from language to VM to DA layer to whatever, right? Like, we believe in a future of millions of chains and rollups. We believe in that kind of landscape being very heterogeneous, and Catalyst is kind of built with that in mind to connect literally all of them. So that's kind of what we're marching towards. We're on Twitter at Catalyst AMM. I'm on Twitter too at 0xGym, although I'm basically just a Catalyst retweeter at this point. So just a wrapper around another Twitter account. But yeah, that's where people can follow us.
I thought for sure we were about to get the first ever friend tech shill right there from you, just given the recent environment. No, I'm kidding. Well, we'll put those links in the show notes for sure. But thanks a lot, Jim. This is a great conversation, man. Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having me.